As the story goes, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his close political ally Vyacheslav Molotov, the namesake of the Molotov cocktail, sat down together on December 12, 1937, and coolly approved the death sentences of 3,167 people. Then they went to the movies. It was, after all, just another day in Stalin's so-called Great Purge, or Great Terror. This brutal political campaign by the Soviet leader lasted from 1936 to 1938 and sought to eliminate all of Stalin's enemies, real or imagined. Under the terror of the Great Purge, no one was safe. It began in the mid-1930s when Stalin started targeting his fellow Bolsheviks who had dared question his ironclad authority over the Soviet Union. During a number of public show trials, and trials not open to the public, they were systematically found guilty of being traitors and summarily executed. Though they'd been coerced into false confessions through torture or intimidation, the trials were a success. Within a couple of years, Stalin was the only original Bolshevik leader left. But Stalin's wrath was not reserved only for his former political allies. During the Great Purge, almost anyone, peasants, intellectuals, minorities, Stalin's communist rivals, soldiers, etc., could become a target. Even Gendrix Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, was not safe. In 1938, he was executed after being found guilty in one of Stalin's infamous show trials. As were some 30,000 soldiers in the Red Army and almost 80% of Stalin's generals. Stalin would not tolerate any perceived threat to his power, so any potential threat was swiftly neutralized. Even family members could be found liable for the so-called crimes of their fathers and husbands, which meant that even children could tragically pay the ultimate price for imagined wrongs allegedly committed by their parents. As one survivor of the Great Purge said, Joseph Stalin wanted power without limit, and thus sought to turn the Soviet Union into a country of 160 million slaves and one free man. The Great Purge was ultimately just one small part of this. Stalin also enforced collectivization policies that triggered devastating mass famines, which may have killed as many as 8 million people, and infamously oversaw the expansion of the Soviet Gulag system from a dozen of camps to some 30,000. To this day, the Great Purge continues to cast a shadow on Soviet history. It was a time of fear, repression, and mass slaughter. Historians estimate that some 750,000 people were killed during the Great Purge, but the true number may be double that. And it doesn't even account for the people who died during famines or while imprisoned in the gulags. Indeed, the true death toll of this period of Soviet history may never be known for certain. You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Fraga.
And I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Austin Harvey.
Today, we're going back in time to Joseph Stalin's terrifying and violent Great Purge. I guess we should note, I'm not sure we noted this during History Happy Hour or not, but the idea for this episode came from a listener who called in.
Yes. Who asked us to... Was this the one that was like over a set of 3 different voicemails?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we got 3 voicemails from somebody who really wanted us to talk about this.
They felt like this is sort of an unknown or overlooked part of history or something that's not covered too much. And it's certainly a pretty, I think, important part of Soviet history.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that too, because a lot of focus was placed on Hitler's Great Purges around the same time. But kind of usurped what our Soviet allies were doing. Yeah,
that's an interesting point. It's because we were allies with the Soviets, it was kind of look the other way a little bit.
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel like this has been a recent sentiment I've had, that we keep forgetting that the Soviet Union was bad also.
Yeah.
I don't want to cast that's such an Americanized way of putting it. They were bad and we were good. Not the case, but we were not allies for most of the 20th century, except that little bit where we were, because we realized there was a worse thing happening.
Right. Well, Stalin and Hitler were allies at first, and then Hitler backstabbed him. It makes me think of, there's an Eddie Izzard joke where I can't remember what the context of the joke is exactly. He talks about history a lot, and I can't remember actually. She is talking about the Soviet Union, and she says she talks about just how many people died during World War II. So they wanted like a buffer zone. That's why they built like the Soviet satellite states and everything, and the Berlin Wall, which isn't a very funny joke the way I'm telling it, but in the context of the comedy special, it was funny and educational. In any case, so we're going to talk about the Great Purge, and I thought a good place to start would just to be about Joseph Stalin himself.
Right, yeah. Little background info.
A little background. He was born in Georgia in 1878. I don't know if you want to attempt to pronounce his name, his birth name or not, but
I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go. We were just talking about this before we started recording. Joseph Stalin's not his real name. He was born Yosef Vissarionis Zhugashvili. And I might not have gotten that 100% right, but that was probably the closest. That
sounded really good. Yeah. It was a long name, intimidating to pronounce, but yeah, that's how he was born. He was sort of like an unlikely, you probably wouldn't guess by looking at him as a boy that he would grow up to be this like murderous dictator, because he was small, he had a deformed arm, he was pockmarked, and he had kind of an overbearing, violent, alcoholic father.
It sort of seems like that's the recipe for making a dictator. Because Hitler was also like not a super intimidating presence as a young man.
No,
when he was an artist.
Not.
Or wanted to be an artist, right? So
he want to be artist. Yeah,
I was going to say, I don't know if it's really fair to call Hitler an artist given the historical everything that happened after. But
I don't think he was like very talented either.
No, I think that was the whole point. Was that he got rejected from art school, and he's like, I guess I'll just be the worst person ever then.
I think that's also an Eddie Izzard joke.
Oh, wow.
Possibly.
Probably.
But anyway, he becomes really inspired by the teachings of Karl Marx. He drops out of school in 1899 and joins the Bolshevik Party, which believes in Marx's ideas. Basically, that the working class would overthrow the ruling class and that a socialist society would be established. Around this time, he changes his name to Joseph Stalin, which means Man of Steel, which is a pretty strong-sounding name.
Right. It's literally what they call Superman.
Right. He became close with Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolsheviks. And after the Russian Revolution, Lenin took power, but he died in 1924, and then Stalin took power. And he moved really quickly to start consolidating his grip on the Soviet Union. Yeah, so we're talking about the Great Purge, but just to put it in the larger context of Stalin's policies, we'll talk about the Great Purge, mass famines that occurred because of his policies, and also the gulags a little bit. His goal was to make the country efficient and industrial, and to do this, he enforced these policies of collectivization, which sought to replace small farms with big state-run farms. But it did not work very well. It meant that between 9 and 11 million peasants were driven off their land. Some 2 million others were arrested or exiled.
Jeez.
Which we'll get back into the gulags in a little bit, but lots of them were being sent there. And the gulags really expanded under Stalin as well. Really from a dozen to tens of thousands.
It's a really weird decision to replace the farms with state-run farms, but then not just use the farmers still.
Well, if they're resisting you,
well, fair enough, I guess.
Yeah, and it's their land. They don't want to give up their land to some state-run company. So there was a lot of resistance. But his goal was we're gonna have these 5-year plans, and we're gonna just make the economy an industrial powerhouse.
Right.
It just did not work. And instead, there were these famines between 1930 and 1933, including in Soviet-controlled Ukraine, which is a famine that has its own name, Holodomor, which means murder through starvation.
Oof.
And many Ukrainian farmers resisted these policies, and they were punished by having their crops taken away, by being deported, or by being killed, which, of course, when you kill the farmers, that results in more famine.
Right.
Stalin claimed that 10 million people died during this period, which is a weird thing to claim, but apparently he did.
That's a really weird thing to... Wow, yeah.
Or he was this is what I did, and make the country better. I don't know.
Yeah.
In any case, the toll of these famines is disputed, but it could be between 5 and 10 million people, which
either way, it's
insane.
Millions of people.
It's millions of people. And, famine is more than just it's fear too. It's such a, it's a control through fear and death. And
yeah, famine's such an interesting... It's one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? It's famine, pestilence. I think death might just be one. Death, famine, war, and conquest, apparently. But I thought it was pestilence, but maybe that's a part of famine. Either way, famine being a big killer historically. But like
Oh, yeah.
something that's like, I think growing up in the United States, kind of hard to imagine like what a genuine famine is like. And like
Right.
mass hordes of people starving to death is like that's brutal. And yeah, like you said, it's like scary.
Yeah, well, that's why I think the Ukrainian word "murder through starvation" is like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's fear, it's death, it's everything.
The Ukrainian language has a lot of really depressing and harsh words.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But then you remember the history of that region. You're like,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, fair.
Yeah, I have a tough go of it. But this is all going on like the early 30s, these famines and everything. And then Stalin starts moving to target basically anyone who is trying to stand up to him and his like increasingly iron grip over the country. And this includes, actually, it starts with his fellow Bolsheviks, his comrades in this revolution in 1917.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because if you built this movement together, so these guys might have their own followers that necessarily don't agree with you, and you're like, no, I'm the one.
Yeah, and they would think that they have a say in it because you all rose up together.
Right, because
one
that's
would think.
theoretically the idea behind the movement was like,
Yeah, right.
yeah.
So what happens is this Bolshevik leader named Sergei Kirov is assassinated in 1934 in St. Petersburg. And it's sort of unknown what happened. Stalin blamed a large conspiracy of anti-Stalin communists for killing this man. But some believe that actually Stalin ordered his death in order to like trigger.
Yeah, it's a pretty good alibi if you kill a person, be like, actually, it was these other people.
Yeah, it happened to be my enemies who did this.
Right.
Because Kirov I think they were close. Like it would have been surprising for him to be involved, but some historians think that he was.
Yeah. I mean, it's not unlike a guy like Stalin to kill a friend or.
Yeah, right. Friends, that was a word that, people didn't always stay his friend for very long. But yeah, so he claims there's like this conspiracy going on, and he begins going after dissenters by killing them or imprisoning them. And this eventually wipes out all the Bolsheviks who had fought alongside him in the Russian Revolution. So he's the only original Bolshevik left.
Wow.
And this largely happens in these public trials called the Moscow trials, as well as a number of like private, not public trials, in which these people uniformly confess to being traitors and spies, but after being tortured or intimidated.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And then they were executed.
Yeah. It's also very easy to justify killing, torturing, and extorting people when you say that they started it.
Right, exactly. They're part of a conspiracy and everything. And so pretty much like they would be found guilty and then executed. So like that was it. And this eliminates all, real or imagined threats to Stalin's rule. But he doesn't stop with just the Bolsheviks. He targets anyone who he calls, this may sound familiar to some people, an enemy of the people.
Ooh, yikes.
Yeah. This includes members of the Communist Party who didn't support him, as many as 1/3 of a party that had 3 million members. So it's about 1 million people right there.
Wow.
Military officers, anti-Stalinist government officials, ordinary people, peasants, minorities, intellects, basically anyone who he felt had a reason to oppose him. So this includes some 30,000 soldiers in the Red Army, some 80% of his own generals, people who he thought might become too popular and be able to fight against him.
Really says a lot about his insecurity as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I think dictators are always, their grip on power seems like ironclad, but it's so delicate.
Right, because it's like, oh, you have this military force working for you, but you're also worried that like people might just like this guy more than you. And that's enough of a threat to you to be like, oh, I have to kill him now. And it's like, all right.
Right. One of the worst things about it is that families are liable for a crime, an accused crime committed by one of their members.
Oh, jeez.
So if your husband or father committed a crime, you could be executed. And this included children as young as 12 years old.
That's ridiculous.
So,
that's insane.
That's very horrible. Yeah. Historians think that at least 750,000 people were executed during the Great Purge, but the number could be higher, could be even double that.
Good God.
It's just kind of hard to know. And alongside this, more than 1 million people were not executed, but were sent to the gulags, which was also not good. And just a quick thing about what the gulags were. I mean, most people, I think, have an idea that these were these prison camps. And they were started by the Bolsheviks in 1919. And then Stalin just made many, many more of them across the country. There were eventually some 30,000 of them. And between the 1920s and the 1950s, between 15 and 18 million people were sent to the camps. It's estimated 1.5 million people died there from starvation or overwork or abuse. But because camp administrators would often discharge someone when they were on death's door, it's really hard to know actually what the true...
I see. So it's this person didn't die in the gulag, but...
The gulag killed them.
Yeah, the gulag killed them. Or it was they didn't technically die in it, but it's we threw them out the day before they died. So they basically... It's like a loophole almost, it feels like, on their end.
Yeah.
They're no, we're not killing people in these camps. People aren't dying in these camps. They're dying a day later in their home after they leave the camp. It's well, why is that? So
they can't be in the official figures. I think it's interesting how much this era casts a shadow on our own in so many ways.
Yeah.
The 1930s and 1940s. It's the thing about history is you think you finish a decade, you kind of wash your hands of it, but it all comes back. We've done some articles on... Well, we have 2 articles. One is how many people did Stalin kill and who killed the most people ever, I think, or something along those lines. It's not Stalin, but he did kill a lot of people, or a lot of people died under his rule. It ranges. It really ranges because, again, these records are kind of difficult to agree on for a lot of different reasons, but the numbers range from 6 to 60 million. Yeah, a lot of the higher estimates were made before the fall of the Soviet Union, so they were a bit more of guesswork because they didn't have access to all these records. But again, it's difficult to calculate not only people who actually died, but someone's taken to the gulag, then a family loses the breadwinner.
Right.
They starve to death or something.
Yeah, the ripple effect of that person being
exactly.
taken. Yeah.
So Stalin can easily be considered one of the most murderous dictators of the 20th century, but the person who killed the most people is probably Mao Zedong, because his policies killed at least 45 million people.
Wow.
People think. So
yeah,
that's a more concrete number, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting too because it's I think if you asked the average person on the street who in history has killed the most people, they'd probably say Hitler, because it's the most obvious and because it was the most blatant and direct, where it was round these people up, put them in camps and kill them, and it was very obvious and on the nose. But the thing with Mao Zedong is really interesting because it's accounting for policy decisions that weren't necessarily just blatantly murdering people.
Yeah, well, a bit of both, but definitely mostly policies. Yeah. Which
I'm sure Hitler's policies were also problematic for people in Germany, but that's not the thing we talk about most. The thing we talk about is he ordered people to be killed en masse.
Right.
And so did Stalin, and so did Zedong. But
I think that during the Holocaust, I'm putting big air quotes in the air, only 11 million people were killed.
Right.
6 million Jewish victims and 5 million non-Jewish victims. And that's a horrible, huge number. But compared to if you say Stalin killed 60 million, let's say on the high end, and Mao maybe killed 45 million, that's that's just insane. It's hard to...
Yeah, no, it's a massive scaling thing because, 11 million people is a lot, obviously, but 60 million's 6 times as much. I don't want to get into the game of comparing tragedies either. I don't want it to come across that way. I just find it's interesting.
It's the context historically, it's interesting to think about or to consider. Stalin himself allegedly once said, "One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic," which is chilling.
Yeah.
And I can't remember where I read this, or maybe it was in college or something, but it's true that the human mind can only really comprehend death to a certain number.
Yeah.
It's maybe I don't know, let's say 100 people, you're wow, that's so many people. But if it's 100,000 people, you just can't really...
Right.
That's really hard to just understand what that means. And 1 million people, 60 million people, that's... Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense because it's just unfathomable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, even just three people died in a car crash. It's oh, wow, that's horrible. But yeah 3,000, 300,000, that's just harder to wrap your mind around.
Yeah, I think the as cold as it is, the comment about it being a statistic is very real
Right.
because it just
And
doesn't
he used
feel
that to his
good.
advantage. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the chilling part about it, right? It's like,
Yeah,
oh, if I kill
exactly.
1,000 people, it doesn't matter as much as if
People
I
just
just kill
can't even
one
deal
guy.
with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
He
that's
died
twisted.
somewhat mysteriously himself.
Yeah, they made a great movie out of that.
Yeah.
It's a
I've
great
seen
movie.
it.
The Death of Stalin, for anyone who's not aware, is a comedy film about Stalin
Right.
dying and then all of his closest allies in government trying to figure out how to cover it up. I think
Mhm.
the cast for that is crazy. Steve Buscemi, Jason Isaacs, and Jeffrey Tambor were in The Death of Stalin. It's a great
I
movie,
see.
if anyone is curious. It's from 2017. I thought it was older than that for some reason.
Well, we have an article on Stalin's death, and it is, like, kind of interesting because there are some it's like he could have been poisoned. It's very possible.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't seem to be a particularly well-liked guy, even among his allies.
And he was about to, like, open, like, more gulags, and he wanted to start, like, a second Great Purge, and it's possible that, like, someone was like, "What if we just slip him some poison?"
Yeah, especially in a post-World War II
Mhm.
period, it would be probably ill-advised to immediately start doing ethnic cleansing again.
Right.
Like,
Although, not like there was a huge appetite for, like, the US to get involved in another war in Europe or
no.
anything,
But there
but
was a lot of tension with the United States and the Soviet Union, I mean, for 40 years after that fact.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And also, like, the rest of Europe would have probably been like, didn't we just fight over this? Wasn't
Yeah,
that, like, the point?
right. Yeah, but I think he died in '53, if I'm remembering
Yeah, 53.
correctly. Yeah. So, that was the end of Stalin, and then other stuff happened, following his death in the Soviet Union, which, of course, collapsed some 40 years later.
I don't even,
Yeah.
who even followed up Stalin? Nikita Khrushchev.
Khrushchev? Yeah. I think he's the one who, at one point, Nixon, when he was the vice president, flew to the USSR, and he and Khrushchev got in this, like, debate over the merits of their respective, countries.
Yeah.
A public debate. I think it was televised.
And that's fascinating. Yeah. I'm just pulling
Yeah.
up a list of Soviet leaders after Stalin. Lenin, Stalin, Malenkov, very briefly before Khrushchev, like very, very briefly, like 4 months. And then Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko. I've heard that name before. And then Mikhail Gorbachev,
Gorbachev.
who just died in 2022.
Recently, right,
I
yeah.
didn't realize that. Wow.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
That's so interesting. I really did not think Gorbachev had been alive that long, which shows how out of tune I am with Russian politics, and forgive my ignorance for that. I'd be so curious what his perception of everything that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev?
Yeah. Like
Yeah, I don't know.
to
I'm not
watch
really
this
sure.
total reconstruction of the political system through.
I mean, he ushered in a lot of, well, I guess it depends what you mean. He ushered in a lot of the changes that, like, helped lead to the fall of the
I'm
Soviet
talking
Union
about like
in
the
terms of, like,
reconstruction after the fact with I said his name earlier and I'm blanking on it now. The guy before Putin.
Boris Yeltsin.
Yeah. To watch that happen and then to watch Putin take power and then to have Putin be in power for the past like 30 something years while you're sitting there and you're like, I remember when this was a completely different place.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm sure his obituary, like, covers things like that, but I don't know.
Not his Russian one, probably.
No, probably not. Yeah, interesting guy.
Yeah, wow. Huh. Yeah. Well, I'm glad this was brought to our attention. This
Yeah, it is. It is a
story.
really fascinating and, like, horrible story, and just this period of Soviet history is a brutal one for
Yeah.
sure.
I think it is something that it kind of is often overlooked because of everything else that was happening in the world at the time. And I do think, and I'm guilty of it too, but in America especially, we're only aware of like the sweeping facts of a lot of things that happen outside of America,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes even inside of America, if we're being truly honest. Like, it's like, oh yeah, people talk about World War II, they talk about the Nazis and Hitler, and that was bad. And then they talk about like the Cold War kind of sometimes, and like the space race and things like that. But it's like, no, you do it like, you go back through like Soviet history and it's like, whoa, that's dark.
Yeah, I find like Cold War history really fascinating,
Mhm.
and Soviet history interesting as well. But yeah, I don't know all that much about this era. It is interesting now, for a long time in the Soviet Union, Stalin was considered a bad egg. But now people don't always have that opinion about him. They actually think he was maybe a good leader and did things that were necessary for the country.
Hmm.
So his like memory has changed a lot since
That's curious.
the 50s to today.
It's very curious. Yeah, I get maybe the sentiment being like, oh, well, he was pushing us forward, even though that kind of...
You put country over like everything else.
Yeah, it took a little, he maybe pushed too quickly or too hard.
Mm-hmm.
And that had some unintended consequences. But I don't agree with that. I'm saying I could see how people could view it that way. Because it was not like an industrial state, really.
Well, and you could also, I guess, if you wanted to like sing Stalin's praises, cast him as a hero of World War II in Russia.
Right.
Someone who led them through the war and things like that.
Right. Because like in other parts of the world, in the United States and like England and things, the Industrial Revolution was sort of just a natural result of progress. It was like new technologies are emerging. We're going to establish these factories and build a new workforce around this. And then when you have sort of like Russia was a little bit late to the party with the monarchy overthrowing compared to every other country who did it like 100-something years earlier. They're a little late to the party.
Still waiting on the Brits.
Right. And then that's still a very feudal system. And you have a lot of peasants who are still like working as predominantly like laborers and farms and things like that. So if you're like, hey, we got to catch up to the rest of the world, we got to do it quickly. And people are going to die, which is a generous way of looking at Stalin. The less generous way is that he was an insecure, bad guy.
Yeah.
He killed a lot of people.
There was this, there's a picture of Stalin and the head of the Soviet secret police. And it's interesting because there's the photo. And then this guy did something to displease Stalin and was killed. And then he's erased from the photo. And so there's like 2 copies of this photo out there. Just like he just tried to erase this guy from history, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, that's telling. That's very telling.
It is telling. It's someone who is insecure and a control freak, I would say.
Yeah. Wow. I'm finding that image now. Wow. That's crazy. I mean, that's like an early doctoring of
early
photograph.
Photoshop.
Yeah. Early Photoshop. I mean, wow.
All right. Well, anonymous caller, thank you for calling in. As we've said before, we do listen to all the voicemails, and we appreciate and would enjoy getting more episode ideas. If you want to leave a voicemail, you can, of course, do that. You can call us at 929-526-3029. If you're terrified of using telephones, that's fine too. You can email us at podcast@allthat'sinteresting.com. And we also read those emails. We'd love to hear from listeners about episode ideas, thoughts on the show,
corrections,
any interesting facts, corrections. Yes,
I've gotten a few.
Any interesting facts you may have about the Soviet Union or that period in history. We welcome them all.
Yeah, for sure. And you can also find us on social media. We're on Instagram at History Uncovered Podcast. On TikTok, still hanging strong at Real History Uncovered, and we'll see. That was extended for 75 days. So we'll see where we're at in like a month or two
nice.
With that one. But for now, you can find us there.
And YouTube.
Just History Uncovered.
Just History Uncovered.
Yeah. Full episodes and YouTube shorts there. Yes. Yeah. If you want to read about any of this stuff, you can go to allthat'sinteresting.com, where we upload constantly. We cover news as well as, larger historical context of things. You can sign up for our newsletter there at allthat'sinteresting.com/sign up if you want to get those email or the stories pushed to your email. You can also become a member at allthat'sinteresting.com/membership, which has a few perks, including an ad-free reading experience on the site and access to our History Happy Hour segment on the podcast. If you're a person who likes to congregate all of your news in one place, like I am, you can follow us on MSN News as well. Is it MSN?
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's MSN. I think the N stands for news. On MSN, our stories are now being published there if you prefer to do your reading that way.
Yeah, MSN News page. Yep.
Okay, maybe the N doesn't stand for news. It's like when people say ATM machine, and I'm like, the M stands for machine.
Alas. But we're everywhere, and our empire is expanding. So check us out anywhere.
I don't think you're allowed to say our empire is expanding at the end of this particular
ATI empire.
This particular
That's
episode.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
our iron
we're in
grip
our
over
expansionist phase right now.
our expansionist era.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks, in 2 weeks.
in 2 weeks with we're talking about Malcolm X's assassination next.
Yes, that's correct. I was like, is that in 2 weeks? But it is.
We're covering Malcolm X's assassination, but kind of like it's the 60th anniversary, which is why we're talking about it, but more about kind of like the weird circumstances surrounding it and whom was actually responsible, similar to what we did with JFK.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. I've read a couple of books on Malcolm X. Fascinating guy, obviously.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing that next time.
Yeah, same. So if you're also looking forward to it, be sure you're subscribed to this podcast. Give us a nice rating if you enjoyed it. And if you didn't enjoy it, keep your opinion to yourself.
That sounds like a good plan. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, we'll be back in a few weeks with Malcolm X. But in the meantime, thanks for listening and talk to you soon.
Toodles.